I'm standing in front of one of the oldest churches on earth, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the old city of Jerusalem. As you can see, Christians from around the world are here visiting this site, the site that many believe Jesus was crucified, buried, rose from the dead on a little hill that's inside the church called Golgotha. The Emperor Hadrian, the Roman emperor, destroyed the state of Judea in the year 135 after a Jewish revolt. The temple had already been destroyed in AD 70, replaced by a temple to a pagan god, Jupiter. Here there was a pagan temple to the god Venus. That was deliberate because the Romans knew that Christians revered this site as some sort of a special place. A Jewish mini-state remained in the land after Judea was destroyed and renamed Syria Palestina, a name that was deliberately picked to insult the Jews because it came from their ancient enemy, the Philistines. Up in the northern Galilee, a Jewish state remained in effect. In fact, the Sanhedrin was reconstituted there. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire was divided. The eastern half was ruled by the Byzantines from Constantinople. The western half remained under Roman rule. The Byzantines fiercely persecuted the Jews here in the land, and many of them fled to the east, to Mesopotamia or Babylon. Yet, some Jewish communities remained, and in fact, the records show in the 6th century there were 43 Jewish communities remaining. The Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century. The temple that was here to Venus was destroyed by his mother, Queen Helena, who came by to find Christian holy sites in this land. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre that you see behind me has 6 denominations operating in it. The Greek Orthodox Church, which was based in Constantinople, but that became Istanbul. The Roman Catholic Church is there. Armenian Orthodox Christians also are there. The Syrian Orthodox Church operates there. The Egyptian Coptic Church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It's not always easy for these different denominations to be together in this building, and there are some clashes. In the year 614, the Persians invaded the land. They damaged the church, but they weren't there very long. In 630, the Byzantines recaptured it. But just a few years after that, in 638, a new religion, Islam, sent its forces up to this land. Behind me, you see the Tower of David. That was a mosque minaret. It's gone between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim rule over the centuries. They also captured the Temple Mount. They began work on a magnificent shrine, the Dome of the Rock. That was finished in the year 691. The Muslims that ruled here didn't set this up as a capital. They ruled the city, but they did so from Baghdad, sometimes from Damascus, sometimes from Cairo. And the different armies from those different areas would clash here in the city often. In the year 1009, the church was destroyed by Caliph al-Hakim. This was one of the prompts for the Crusades. The Pope in Rome said, we must go to the Holy City, we must recapture it. And in 1096, Crusader forces landed down on the coast, capturing the city of Jerusalem in 1099. But it didn't last very long. They were defeated by the Muslim forces led by Saladin up near the Sea of Galilee in the year 1187. Jerusalem was again under Muslim rule, and they were finally pushed out of the entire land in 1291. Meanwhile, Jews were being expelled from various European countries. The Roman Catholic Church was unhappy that they had helped the Muslims to retake the city. They were expelled from England, then from France, then from Germany, from Hungary, finally from Spain and Portugal in 1492 and 97. The Muslims again were ruling this land. Again, it was different Muslim groups often clashing, the Mamluks. They were based in Damascus and in Cairo. And then in the year 1516, a new empire took control. The Turkish Ottoman Empire gained this city and the surrounding areas. And these magnificent walls that you see behind me were built by Suleiman the Magnificent. At that time, the records show there were 30 Jewish communities in the land. And the Turkish Muslims were fairly tolerant of the Jews living here. Persecution decreased and Jewish life was thriving fairly well. But that was at the beginning. Towards the end of the Ottoman rule, more anti-Jewish rulers emerged that persecuted the Jews, and it was a bad situation that only started to change when the European powers gained more and more influence in the 1800s.
Much of Israel's remarkable history happened right here in Tel Aviv. David Dolan tells us more as he continues his story on the modern state of Israel.
I'm standing in a sand dune here near the coast. The Mediterranean Sea is out here. Behind me you see the modern, thriving city of Tel Aviv. But much of the countryside 150 years ago was like this, sandy, just a bit of vegetation, hardly any trees, not that many people living in it. When the Ottoman Empire began, it was fairly tolerant of the Jewish community living here, which wasn't many people, but it was a few thousand. But that toleration started to wane as the centuries went on. And by the 1800s, there was major violence occurring from time to time against the Jewish community. The Christians were also suffering here under the Ottoman Turkish rule at times. There was a major pogrom against the Jewish community of Damascus in the 1840s, which prompted a mass migration of the Jews from there to the land. They were also coming from Egypt. They were coming from Iraq to the east and what later became Jordan and other places, and some were even coming from Europe. In 1857, a rabbi in Europe, in Serbia, had an idea. Let's recreate the Jewish state. Let's bring the Jewish people back from around the world. He advocated this in his synagogue and took it around Europe. It was a very popular program, but it was a bit premature. The Turkish Muslims were still ruling here. In 1839, the Church of Scotland sent out a delegation to examine the violence happening against the Jews. They recommended a Jewish state here as well. They advertised this throughout Europe in different newspapers, etc. So the desire for the Jews to return here was growing. Then in the 1880s, as the Jews were finally a majority in Jerusalem again for the first time in 1700 years, the pogroms broke out in Russia. Whole Jewish communities were destroyed, wiped out, and again a mass migration of Jews began from there and later from Poland. Most went to North America and other parts of Europe, but around 25,000 came here to the land. This became known as the first wave of Aliyah, or immigration going up to Zion. Around this time, a French military official named ALFRED DREYFUS was charged with treason. He was tried in Paris. A young journalist came to cover the trial from Vienna named THEODOR HERZL. He was shocked when he was found guilty on such flimsy evidence, and later that conviction was overturned. But this prompted him to write a book called The Jewish State, an attempt at a modern solution to the Jewish question. It advocated Jews to return here from around the world, and he is considered the father of modern Zionism today. The next year, in 1897, we had the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. This brought together Jews from around Europe, in fact from the United States, from Australia and other parts of the globe, and they put together a program to recreate a Jewish state here. They also showed the new Jewish flag, the new flag that Israel would eventually have with the Star of David in the center of it. They began their meeting by singing what would become Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, the hope, to be a free people back in the land of Zion and Jerusalem after 2,000 years of exile. Well, meanwhile, the pogroms continued in Russia. There was another wave of Jews coming to the land from 1904 until 1914. Another 25,000 came. Well, the local Arabs didn't like this, and actually the growing Jewish nationalism was creating an effect amongst them, and growing Arab nationalism was rising at the time, and they demanded that the Jewish immigration to the land stop. In 1898, the first all-Jewish town was built just north of modern Tel Aviv called Petah Tikva, the Gates of Hope. I lived there when I first moved to Israel in 1980. In 1909, Jews gathered in these sand dunes to plan a new town that would become the urban center of Israel, Tel Aviv. Today, over 1 million people living in it, over 100 years old, a thriving city. As the Jews kept coming back, however, the winds of war were blowing in Europe. World War I was about to begin. It would change the course of Jewish history as well.
David Dolan's backdrop this week is the old city of Jerusalem, a great vista from which to continue his remarkable saga of the modern state of Israel.
Behind me are the walls of the old city built by Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman leader. This area was a center of World War I. The British forces in the area were led by General Edmund Allenby. During World War I, the British High Commissioner in Cairo promised the Arab leader of the whole region, Sharif Hussein down in Mecca, that if the Allies were victorious in the war, they would help establish a number of Arab states after the war. But he also said that they wanted to keep this area, Palestine, as a separate entity with the idea that the Jews would have a state here, and also to the north Lebanon as a separate entity where the Christians could have some autonomy. Sharif Hussein agreed to this proposal. In 1919, his son Faisal endorsed this proposal as well. Well, in 1917, General Allenby, right behind me here, walked by foot through Jaffa Gate after British forces captured the city of Jerusalem. He said, "I cannot ride," even though he was a cavalry leader with a great horse, "I cannot ride where the Messiah walked." And the people cheered as he came into the city. Well, just 1 month before, the British government in London had promised the Jewish people a national homeland here in Palestine. It was called the Balfour Declaration. Less than 1 year after the Balfour Declaration was released, World War I was over. General Allenby's forces defeated the Turks up in the valley of Megiddo, north of Jerusalem. The Allies all gathered together a couple years later at San Remo to decide how to carve up the Ottoman Empire, who would get what, etc. And a mandate was given to Great Britain to establish a Jewish national home here in Palestine. And a mandate was given to the French to do the same up in Lebanon and in Syria. And indeed, states were created for the Arabs, as the British had promised. Transjordan, just to the east of us, was created out of what was the Mandate of Palestine. The Jews weren't so thrilled about this because that meant that 2/3 of the area that they thought they could set a Jewish state up in had been cut off from Jewish settlement. But still, it was implied they could settle everywhere west of the Jordan River, which would include what is today known as the West Bank. But in 1922, Winston Churchill implied that that would not be the case, that the Jewish state would be smaller still. Jews could settle in parts of Western Palestine, but not necessarily in all of it. Well, also in 1922, the League of Nations endorsed this British mandate and the French mandate. But in 1921, before that happened, in May, the very first wide-scale Arab resistance to the returning Jews took place. Major riots in the cities of the land. Nearly 50 Jews were slaughtered down on the coast in Jaffa and in many other parts of the area. Through the 1920s, Jews kept coming back. Nearly 60,000 made Aliyah in what was known as the fourth wave of Aliyah. Most of them came from Russia and from Poland. They were city dwellers. Most of them settled not in the farms, but down in Tel Aviv and other places. Well, it wasn't long after that, in 1929, that the Arab pogroms broke out that were the worst in the history of the Jews returning. That was led by Haj Amin Husseini, the Muslim leader of Jerusalem. Hundreds of Arabs poured out from the Temple Mount, and over 113 Jews were killed. The Jewish community of Hebron was completely slaughtered. The chief rabbi hung upside down and skinned alive. It was a terrible pogrom, and it was just a sign of the great violence that was to come in the 1930s and 40s. All of this as Jews kept coming back, and that increasing in the 30s as a man named Adolf Hitler took control of Germany.
The backdrop this week to our continued story of the modern State of Israel is the historic Independence Hall in Tel Aviv. Here's David Dolan.
I'm standing in Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, where the State of Israel was declared in 1948. But much happened in the years before that led to that historic moment. In 1931, the Arab leader of the land, Haj Amin Husseini, held a pan-Islamic conference bringing Muslims from around the region where they declared there will be no Jewish state here in the land. 2 years later, a man named Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, soon after writing Mein Kampf, where he declared that all the Jews of Europe would be slaughtered. 250,000 Jewish refugees fled Germany during the 1930s and came here to live in the land. As the numbers increased, the Muslim resistance increased as well. And in 1936, an Arab general strike was held. 80 Jews were killed in rioting throughout the land. As a result of that, the British held a conference and decided to partition the land into an Arab and a Jewish state, no longer promising to fulfill the mandate's call for just a Jewish state west of the Jordan River. Soon after that, another general strike broke out in 1938. More Jews were killed, more Arabs were killed. The Arabs here felt for sure that Hitler would launch a war in Europe and would be victorious, and they would never have to put up with the Jewish state here. In 1939, as a result of that violence, the British issued something called the White Paper at a conference in London. It proposed a binational state in which the Jews would be a minority. Only 75,000 more Jews would be let into the land after that, and then no more. Well, the Jews realized this was a recipe for disaster. They would probably be killed by the Arab majority here in the land. Nevertheless, they accepted this plan. Later that same year, Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began. It would be a disaster for the Jewish people. The Holocaust would take the lives of 6 million Jews. Few Jews in the land here believed what they were hearing, that this mass slaughter was taking place. Meanwhile, German General Rommel was on his way to Palestine with the goal of driving the Jews out of the land and taking the Holy Land for Germany. It didn't happen. His forces were stopped in Egypt by Allied forces, which by now included the United States. That was in July of 1942. During the war, Winston Churchill promised the Jews a state despite the White Paper, and they fought with him and helped him in his war effort. By 1947, the British wanted out of this conflict. Following the war, the new government in London went back on that promise of a Jewish state, again proposing a binational state. Attacks were launched against British positions here in the land by various Jewish groups. Trains were blown up and other things. In Cairo, Haj Amin Husseini was organizing an Arab army to take the land after the war. In November of 1947, the UN voted to partition the land into a Jewish and Arab state. The Jewish state would be in 3 different parts. It was a recipe for disaster, and yet it was still accepted by the Jews. And yet, the state of Israel was born in this hall, May 14th, 1948. This Declaration of Independence was signed by David Ben-Gurion and 18 other delegates. The State of Israel was born.
This is a model of the Burma Road, a strategic road for survival constructed by Israeli forces during the War of Independence. David Dolan joins us now to tell us more about that road and a miraculous story against encroaching Arab forces.
The day after the UN Partition Plan was approved in New York, the fighting over this land began. Irregular Arab forces from Iraq, from Syria, from Jordan, from Lebanon, and from Egypt crossed over. Others came from Libya and further away to help the local Arabs, the Fedayeen, in the battle against the Jews. The British were still here, but they mostly stood on the sidelines and let the Jews fight for themselves. But they hadn't allowed the Jewish community here to bring in heavy weapons. They had no aircraft, they had no actual tanks, they just had the arms they were manufacturing themselves, light arms for the most part. The Arabs were convinced that they would swiftly defeat the Jews and there would be no Jewish state when the British left in the middle of May. The fighting became fierce in February and March. Tiberias was captured on April 19th, Haifa on April 23rd. The fighting spread down to the Tel Aviv area. Jaffa was captured by the Jewish forces on May 12th. Meanwhile, Palestinians, Arabs started to flee their homes in greater numbers. Some 20,000 had fled by May 15th. They were convinced they would soon come back to their homes after the war was easily won by the Arab powers around them. The road to Jerusalem, the main road connecting Tel Aviv and the coastal areas to the Jewish community in western Jerusalem, was cut off in the fierce battles. It was then reopened, but after the Declaration of Independence on May 15th, the Jordanian army, the Jordanian Arab League forces, joined the battle. They were very well trained by the British. They circumvented Jerusalem and came down the hill to the Latrun Junction. Fierce battles took place there, and they defeated the Jewish forces, and again the road was completely closed. No supplies were getting up to the Jewish community in Jerusalem. Food was short, water was running out, medicines were running out. So the Jews opened an alternative route, and we're standing at the site where that began. It was dubbed the Burma Road after the great road that was opened during World War II by the Allies connecting Burma to China. And it succeeded in bringing supplies around the main road up into Jerusalem. And you can see part of the road behind me here. The battles were fierce, and by the middle of June, the Arabs had tired of the battle. They were not fighting very well anymore. The Jews were continuing to fight back with strength. Historians say it's because the Jews were fighting for their lives. They knew their country was going to be destroyed if they lost this war. Many of them were Holocaust survivors that literally got off of the boats from Europe and were given a gun and told to go to the war front. Their motivation was extremely high. A truce was declared on June 10th. During this period of fighting, another 200,000 to 300,000 Palestinians had fled their homes. Most of them didn't go to other countries, though. They went to the areas that the Partition Plan designated for a Jewish state. They went to family homes in Judea and Samaria. They went to homes in the Gaza Strip and other areas. But about a third went to Jordan and to Lebanon and to Syria and other places. Fighting resumed on July 8th and lasted till July 18th. Another 20,000 to 30,000 Arabs fled their homes during this time. And this was the only time that the Israeli forces deliberately evacuated some of the Arabs from their homes. That was in two towns, Ramleh and Lida, right next to the vital Ben Gurion airport, the only airport in the country at that time. There was another ceasefire, as I said, in July, and that lasted until mid-October when fighting began again. And during this time, this third period of fighting, the Jews succeeded in reopening the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and this Burma bypass was no longer so essential. More Palestinians fled their homes during this time. The UN said that the total Palestinian refugee flight was 726,000. The Israelis said it was more like 600,000 since, as I said, many had gone back to family homes, hadn't really become refugees at all. The Arabs put the number at over 1 million. 6,372 Jews lost their lives during this war, by far the greatest death toll in any of Israel's wars. 1% of the population, 2,400 of those were civilians.
This is the beautiful Golan Heights in northern Israel, an important part of David and Solomon's kingdom nearly 3,000 years ago. As noted on recent programs, this land was also included in God's covenant with Moses and Joshua as an inheritance for the children of Israel. David Dolan joins us now from this strategic site where he continues his chronology of the modern state of Israel.
I'm standing in an Israeli army bunker on the Golan Heights on one of the highest hills here. Behind me is Damascus and Syria, about 35 miles away. We'll talk more about them in a few minutes. In the early 1950s, 650,000 Jews came to this land from Arab countries, many of them kicked out in anger because the Arabs were so upset that the state of Israel had been reborn. And they settled all over the country. Meanwhile, Arab terror attacks increased. Over 1,000 Jews were killed between 1951 and 55, 400 of them from the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Gamal Nasser forged ties with the Soviet Union and started to receive weapons from them. He nationalized the Suez Canal, which the British had built, angering Britain very, very much. A secret plan was devised between Britain, France, and Israel to strike at Egyptian forces in the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula and get back the Suez Canal. In October 29, 1956, that war begun. But the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, was very upset over this. He feared an East-West clash, a superpower war, and he basically ordered France and Britain to call off their forces and Israel to stop its offensive. The Israelis had gotten all the way to the Suez Canal. And in early November, a ceasefire was declared, and by March the next year, Israeli forces had completely withdrawn from the land they captured, the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. In the summer of 1964, the Arab countries and the Palestinians met together in Jerusalem to form a new organization, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yasser Arafat was the head of the largest faction. In 1965 and 66, the Syrians stepped up their attacks on the Jewish communities in the Hula Valley below from this Golan Heights. In April of 1967, they actually destroyed an entire kibbutz, Kibbutz Gadot. There were air battles, there were tank battles. Meanwhile, down in Egypt, Nasser was vowing openly that he would destroy Israel. He ordered UN forces withdrawn from the Sinai Peninsula in May of '67. He blockaded the Israeli port of Eilat, which is an act of war, and he told the world, we're going to attack Israel. He made alliances with Iraq, with Syria, with Jordan, with other Arab countries. The Israelis were facing forces 3 times as large as they had, tank forces, air forces, all supplied by the Soviet Union. They feared they would be destroyed. So they took a decision to take the first strike. In a carefully calibrated attack, they struck the Egyptian Air Force in its bases in 15 locations, wiped out 90% of Egypt's Air Force. They did the same thing behind me here in Syria later that afternoon. Their enemies were defenseless from the air effectively. It only took 2 days for Israel to capture the old city of Jerusalem, and by June 10th, just 5 days after the war began, they had captured this entire Golan Heights, the entire West Bank, and the entire Sinai Peninsula up to the Suez Canal. The Arab world was shocked by Israel's lightning victory in the Six-Day War. The Soviets were humiliated and they broke all diplomatic ties with Israel. Israel, though, offered to pull out of most of the territory it captured. The Arab leaders met in September in Khartoum and said no negotiations, no peace with Israel. Israel must be destroyed. Right after that, a war began called the War of Attrition. The Egyptians striking Israeli forces almost every day, and hundreds of soldiers were killed until that ended in the summer of 1970. The next war would be the Yom Kippur War. This time the Arabs didn't announce it in advance. They made secret plans to strike Israel on the holiest day of its year, Yom Kippur, when most Jews are fasting, television and radio is shut down. At noon, the sirens went off on October 6, 1973, signaling that another war was about to begin. Men all over the country rushed to their positions, and at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, the war began. Israel this time was on the run. They were pushed off of most of this Golan Heights. They were pushed back in the Sinai almost to their borders. It was a terrible war with very high casualties. But by the second week of the war, Israel was turning the tide with help from the United States. The Soviets were very unhappy with this, and on October 25th, they began loading their own forces into aircraft with the object of coming here, their own men on the ground, to aid Syria and Egypt. The United States called a nuclear alert in response to that, and the Soviets backed down and a ceasefire was declared. But Israel lost over 2,300 soldiers in that war, with many, many more casualties. And the government of Israel, humiliated by this defeat, initial defeat at least, would later be tossed out of office, and the Likud party would rise to power. The Labor Party that had ruled since 1948 would be finished.
David Dolan joins us this week from a hillside overlooking the area of Bethlehem in what's called the West Bank. These bunkers are the remnants of numerous wars as surrounding nations have sought to lay claim to this very strategic site. David continues with his account there of the modern state of Israel.
I'm standing on a hilltop near Kibbutz Ramat. This was a strategic battleground in both 1948 and 67. You can see some of the bunkers that Israel built here to fight against the Palestinians and the Jordanians. Behind me is Bethlehem, one of the largest Arab towns in the Palestinian Authority today. This area has been the center of the dispute for so many years in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But let's go back to the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. Israel suffering very much in that war, and Egypt as well. The finances in Egypt were decimated by the war. The leader Anwar Sadat made a strategic decision in the mid-70s to break ties with the Soviet Union and establish them with the United States. And then he decided to make peace with Israel. He showed up at the Knesset here in Jerusalem in November of 1977, declaring he was ready for peace. But in the meantime, the violence continued. In April of 1978, Israel suffered her worst terror attack ever, the Coastal Road Massacre. The PLO had been kicked out of Jordan in 1970, set up a mini-state in South Lebanon. From there, they were launching attacks upon the Jewish people constantly. 33 Israelis were killed, many of them children, most of them civilians. Nevertheless, the peace process got going, Jimmy Carter inviting both Sadat and the new Israeli leader, Menachem Begin, who had ousted the Labor Party in May of 1977 in a revolutionary election here in Israel. He was invited to come as well. The pundits said peace won't happen. The Begin government is too right-wing. They were wrong. 13 days of grueling negotiations took place at Camp David. The leaders walked out several times. The main issue was Jerusalem. In the end, Jimmy Carter said to Sadat, give Begin a letter with your position. To Begin, give Sadat a letter with your position. That's what they did, and they were able to sign the Camp David Accords. Those accords had two parts. One was the Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula that Israel had captured during the '67 war. It was a phased withdrawal that began in 1981. I was actually down in the Sinai at the time. It was very controversial. Many said Begin had betrayed the right wing here by agreeing to that. Nevertheless, it was carried out. The second part of the accord dealt with the area behind me, the Palestinian zones. They were to get self-governing autonomy during peace talks that would also involve Jordan, they would involve Lebanon, they would involve Syria. Well, it never happened. The Arab countries totally rejected the Oslo Accords, and Anwar Sadat was shot dead by one of his own army officers in October of 1981. Meanwhile, the PLO continued to launch attacks into Israel. I was living on a kibbutz along the northern border, and frankly, we spent most of our time living in a bomb shelter. It became intolerable, and everybody knew that the Begin government was preparing some sort of major military action. Well, early June 1982, the Israeli ambassador to London was assassinated. That was the spark that set off the war. It wasn't just an air operation as before, it was a ground operation. Begin intended it to be just in South Lebanon, but his defense minister, Ariel Sharon, had other ideas. He wanted to see the Syrians thrown out of Lebanon, as well as the PLO. He wanted that to happen so a final peace accord would be possible. So the war went all the way up to Beirut, and the fighting was heavy. The world was condemning Israel for that. But Israel had a great victory against the Syrians, in the air in particular, knocking out over 80 MiG jets and losing only a few themselves. But the demand here in the country for Israel to pull back kept growing. And finally, in 1985, Israel completed a withdrawal to the security zone, a small strip of land right along the border that they controlled until the year 2000. Yasser Arafat was tossed out of the country and ended up in Tunis, where he continued the struggle against Israel. But it didn't stop the terror attacks. They continued in the 80s. Israel's economy was hard hit by that war. Hyperinflation hit up to 450%, and there was a demand for a total pullout from Lebanon. Meanwhile, back here, the struggle was continuing. Israel was starting to build settlements, such as this one that was later built, Har Homa, but even in that era they were building settlements. The tensions were building, and this would later lead to a great explosion of violence, the first Palestinian uprising.
Eastward, there was a land that in Bible times was known, and to Bible readers is known as, in effect, the Promised Land. Well, that was the biblical vision. But what's the current division? Right now we have here the land of Israel, but I'm standing at a place right here where we're about 9 miles away from the Mediterranean Sea. Behind me is a village dotted with minarets, a sign of an Islamic triumph So we have biblical vision on one hand, and we have current political division on the other. Goodness, David, what do we make of this?
Well, we are dealing with a tiny land, and you know, it really isn't clear to a lot of people around the world just how small this is. We've been up on the Golan Heights, and there is a lot in the south, and we're talking about 280 miles at its longest. But the main problem is this was the pre-67 border, this here. Now, it's really small here. We're talking, as you said, 9 miles at its narrowest, but on average it's 15 miles wide. Here's Tel Aviv. Here's Haifa, here's Netanya and Herzliya right over here. 2/3 of Israel's Jewish population lives right in this area. And if you take it all the way from the northern border to the Gaza Strip, 80% of Israel's Jews live in a 15-mile wide on average piece of land.
Who's living here, David?
And this is mostly Arab towns and villages. And as you pointed out, some are inside of Israel, inside of this pre-67 border. But Nablus is here. Here's Jerusalem. You can see the border went right through the heart of the city. Israel had the western part and the Arabs had the eastern part. It's tiny. And all the way across, if you take that line out, right here, it's about 30 miles. At its widest, it's 55 miles. It's tiny.
If I understand correctly, the biblical vision extends downward further this way. It extends upward to the Euphrates, out this way. That's the biblical vision.
Mm-hmm.
The Palestinian vision, the mandate, calls for pushing Israel into the sea.
The sea.
I mean, we're getting awfully narrow here, aren't we?
And we talked earlier about the Partition Plan, the UN Partition Plan, and it was even smaller what Israel was going to have. The Arabs would have had a part of this, they would have had further down here, etc. But even without that, even with what they got in the 48 war, it's tiny. And to give that back to the Palestinians for a state is going to again leave Israel extremely exposed. She's 1/8 of 1% of the population of the whole Middle East. Tiny little land with just a few million people. It's very vulnerable to missile attack in particular.
Yeah, we can see it from here. The Mediterranean Sea. I mean, it's a stone's throw away in effect. You know, I think, tell me what you think of this. Let's say there's a man who's unhappy with his wife. You weigh 120 pounds. If you lose 10 pounds, I'd love you more. She loses 10 pounds. She's 110 pounds. If you lose 10 pounds more, we get along. If you lose 10 pounds more, 10 pounds more, it gets to the point it's not about the pounds. There's something wrong in the thought process. Oh, if Jews would just give up a little more of the real estate, it's a small parcel, and we're already pushing against it to gobble up more and more of the Jewish homeland. This isn't the Bible. Whoever carved up this turkey never read the biblical text.
Exactly. And you know, the Palestinians have just made a film in which they take over Tel Aviv. It was made down in the Gaza Strip. They go through the streets and they've driven all the Jews out of the land entirely. And that is the vision of Muslim fundamentalists. No Jewish state. A Jewish state contradicts their faith. Islam's the final truth. The truth of that statement was proved by their capture of Jerusalem, they believe. Yeah. So a lot of them just want to see Israel gone entirely.
Well, I guess we're going to see whose God is stronger. And that's the old way of doing business. You know, nations would fight, they'd pray to their gods, and the winner had the stronger God. Well, he who keeps watch over Israel has been keeping watch over us for thousands of years, and I trust he'll guide us through this dilemma. What says David Dolan?
I believe it as well. It's a miracle that Israel exists at all. All these wars, etc., God's going to keep Israel until the end, I'm sure of it.